Hey everybody, Mr. Smith here with the assignment for this week, which is the European Age of Exploration. So over the last 2 weeks, we've focused on the Renaissance, which remember was that movement from about 1400 to about 1600, 1650. That was a revival of science and learning and education and arts and culture within Europe following the end of the feudal period in Europe. And one of the effects of that revival, especially revival of science and learning, was these advances in navigation and in the actual sailing ships themselves that allowed Europeans to travel a lot further across the oceans and around the world than they had before. And this led to the beginning of the so-called European Age of Exploration. And so those couple things that led to that exploration. The first was a growing interest in trade in Europe as they recovered from the Black Death. Remember that during the feudal period, most of the trade was really local. It was the small fiefdoms that were just sort of trading in and amongst themselves. But after the Black Death, these little fiefdoms, because of the destruction of the Black Death, because of the famines that were caused, because of all the livestock and all the fields and crops that died along with the Black Death, they could no longer sustain themselves. They couldn't just, run within their own fiefdom and have everything they need to live. Instead, they had to start trading, sometimes all the way across Europe or even into Asia, in order to have just the basic things that they needed to survive. So this all led to an increase in trade. It led to this rise of a merchant class, which is a group of people that their whole job was to trade with other places. And as Europe slowly recovers from the Black Death, they become more and more interested in spreading their trade further and further around the world. And they were able to do that because of the second cause of the European Age of Exploration, which was this new sailing and navigation technologies. And it's really important to note that they did not invent these technologies in Europe. None of these technologies were invented by Europeans. They weren't even perfected by Europeans or made better by Europeans. Instead, it was just the Renaissance that opened up Europeans to the idea of taking inventions and ideas and technology from other cultures, where before, especially because of the influence of the church, they were really insular. They didn't want technology and ideas and things from other cultures. But during the Renaissance, they start talking more and more to mathematicians and other educated people in the Islamic Empire. They start trading with and having contact with people as far away as Southeast Asia and Indonesia. And because of that, they got things like compasses and astrolabes, which are tools for navigation from mathematicians in the Islamic Empire. And they got things like better ships, better hulls, that's the bottom of the ship, in particular from the Malay Empire in Southeast Asia. And then improved sails, and this was probably the single biggest, most important thing, was European sails really sucked before this, but they got these really great sails from the Javanese Empire in Indonesia. And so they went from being able to have these ships that could basically just cross the Mediterranean, that had to stay in really shallow and calm seas. They couldn't take any rough weather, to being able to cross the entire ocean, to be able to go across the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And they went from being unable to leave the site of land to having to navigate by following the shore, to being able to go across vast empty distances and still be able to find their way using that new navigation equipment. And finally, they were inspired by all of this cultural contact following the Black Death, all of these, trading and other things with other cultures to go explore and find more of the world. And in particular, the Chinese Empire can take credit for inspiring them, because the Chinese Empire had been exploring for hundreds and hundreds of years around the world. And that's what really kicked off the European interest in exploration as well. So we are going to look at the European Age of Exploration this week, but it's really important to note first, before we talk about that a little more, that this is the European Age of Exploration, and we end up talking about that a lot in history class, partly because of the stuff that followed out of it, the colonialism and the age of empires that followed the European Age of Exploration. But it's really important to note that Europeans are not the first to go exploring around the globe. So as I already mentioned, the Chinese had been exploring all of Asia and as far away as Africa and Australia and possibly even North America for hundreds of years before the Renaissance, before Europeans start leaving the Mediterranean Sea. And Polynesian people had been successfully navigating and sailing across the Pacific Ocean. They're sailing between these tiny little chains of islands in this massive, massive ocean that has really horrible currents and weather for sailing since at least the 9th century. So we're thinking, 600 years before the Renaissance. And you might know a little bit about some of those Polynesian sailing techniques if you've watched the movie Moana, which does an okay job of teaching you about some of that. But the European Age of Exploration that we're going to be focused on here, it really started with the Portuguese. They discovered some islands off the coast of the Iberian Peninsula in about 1419, and it lasts all the way until the Dutch are exploring around Australia and Antarctica in the 1660s. And the beginning period was really led by Spain and Portugal, who discovered Africa and the Americas and divided them up between them. And then eventually the English, the Dutch, the French, the Germans, and a bunch of other European countries join in, and they end up dividing up the entire world map, basically besides Asia, between themselves. And when they found these new lands, they would claim them in the name of their kingdom. So if you're a Spanish explorer, you go off and discover a new place that Europeans hadn't been before, and you say, this is now Spain, this is a part of the Spanish Empire. And this is despite the fact that there were existing nations and kingdoms and empires and tribes already living there. And think of the massive super sophisticated advanced Incan Empire in South America that ends up getting claimed by Spain. All these people already existed there, but European explorers would find them and say, this is ours now. And that began this cycle of conquest and enslavement, and exploitation of the environment and local national resources, and eventually colonial settlement, European people actually physically moving into the land after they had either killed or enslaved or driven off the people that were living there before. And this is the cycle that's called the Age of Colonialism, and it sort of runs right after, but also overlapping with the Age of Exploration, and it lasts all the way until the mid-1900s, and really there are still remnants of that Age of Colonialism around today. And a lot of what you're going to be learning in history class from this point until the end of your high school career, and if you choose to study history in college as well, is going to be focused on that history of colonialism and empire. But this week we're going to look at the exploration themselves. So you're going to get a world map, and it's going to have some questions on it, and you need to make sure that you follow the directions very, 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 very carefully. There are step-by-step directions. When you first open the map, it's mostly going to be blank. So you have to follow the directions to sort of fill it in and to be able to see the little pieces of text, to be able to see the charts, to be able to see the lines that are going to make you be able to answer the questions. And you'll sort of chart the history of the European Age of Exploration as you go through and answer all of those questions. And then when moving forward, our last couple weeks of the quarter, we're going to look at two of the biggest effects of the Age of Exploration, which were the Columbian Exchange and the Atlantic slave trade. And that's going to sort of wrap us up and lead you into where you're going to start 8th grade. So this week, just open that document that's linked below this, and that's got a link to the map that you're going to be using, and it's got all of the directions step by step that you need to follow to answer those questions. So make sure you go through and read those directions. They're in blue. Make sure you read them and answer each of those questions. And make sure you do them in order. If you try to jump around, it's not going to work very well. So read those directions, follow them, and get all those questions answered. And if you have any problems with any of that, make sure to email me or drop into the Zoom office hours, and we can help you get those questions answered.